Hello and welcome to Rights of the Free People, a program of the Rhode Island affiliate of the American Civil Liberties Union. My name is Dan Weissman. I'm a volunteer at the ACLU and host of this program. Our topic this month is issues affecting the trans community, and we're going to begin by defining what that all means. First, I want to introduce my guests. Closest to me, literally speaking, and an old friend, me, is Jaye Watts, who was a former student at Rhode Island College and now is out changing the world. I take some of the credit for that. Jaye is the Trans Health Program Director at Thunder Mist, one of our field placement agencies in the School of Social Work, and good that you're there and supervising students, of course. With Jaye is Justice Gaines. Justice is an organizer at Rhode Island Jobs for Justice. We have had other people from Jobs for Justice on this program over the years, but first time for you.
Yes.
A rookie. We have a rookie. Yes. And we're going to explore several issues affecting the trans community with an emphasis on education. That seems to be where the public attention seems to play out most in schools and educational issues. So Rhode Island Department of Education, RIDE, recently came out with some directives for school districts. What was that all about?
So they came out with a guidance a couple of years ago for a policy, and over time, I know that the ACLU did a report of little ways back, seeing what schools had put policies in place and what that was looking like. And we saw that there were schools that hadn't done anything, schools that were doing things that were not in line with the guidance. And so there was an advocacy effort over the past year to work with the Department of Education around creating, making that guidance mandatory, that school districts put something in place. Because often what I've seen as an advocate is that the districts that did not have any policies were often where we saw youth that were having the most difficulty.
An example of difficulty?
Difficulty with teachers that don't have training, kids that are not being called by the right names and pronouns in their school, who are having difficulty with accessing appropriate locker rooms and bathrooms. Just in general, they didn't have anything in place, so it's like reinventing the wheel each time a young person came out.
So when was that, the directives?
I believe it was July of 2016.
Yeah, so that was when the guidance came out.
So about 2 years ago.
Yes.
And what has happened as a result? Are all the school districts in line? Do we have some, we don't need to name them necessarily, but are we still in the process of bringing everybody online with regulations?
My understanding that with the regulation now, that schools have until July 1st to submit a policy. And so I'm not sure where we are at, if all schools have done that at this point yet.
Okay. So maybe we'll come back and look at why that's so important. But I think a first step is to define what we're talking about. What's this trans business? Who's affected, who's not? How would the public or a teacher know?
So transgender or trans usually refers to individuals whose gender is different than what they were told at birth, right? So I'm a trans woman, so I was, when I was born, the doctor said I was a male, however, I identify and I am a woman. And so trans sort of encompasses a large group of people who might have been assigned male at birth, like myself, but identify as women, might have been assigned female at birth, but identify as men, or people who don't identify as a man or as a woman, or maybe they do both, or maybe culturally they have a different gender. And so transgender or trans, which we often shorten it to, just really encompasses that whole group of people. With what we're talking about here today, it primarily is talking about trans students and trans youth. And so often younger folks who are figuring themselves out, figuring out what their gender is, sort of learning about themselves and seeing that maybe what they were told or how they were raised isn't quite how they feel or doesn't line up with who they might feel they are.
And is there a typical age range when kids begin to figure out, oh, this is, yes, what the gender I was assigned, that's right, that seems to fit, but no, or no, I'm questioning, or I think I'm the other gender?
I think in my experience, both personally and with many other friends and colleagues who are also trans, it's a very different journey for everyone. I know people who have always known. I know people who have known when they were younger. I know people who who started really understanding it when they were 40 years old. I know people who have discovered in middle school, people who have discovered in college, people who have discovered when they changed jobs and they started working around trans people. I think something that is a commonality is often when we're able to see other people be themselves, it does help us start to be able to understand ourselves a little bit more. And I think, for me, example, I knew when I was young, so I knew, right? I thought I knew. Then for a long time, I didn't know. And so I was very much trying to be a boy for a very long period of time. And it wasn't until I got around other trans people and I was able to sort of unpack that for myself a little bit more. So it really changes for everyone. It's really a very unique journey for every single trans person, sort of how they come into their identity.
So we're talking about schools because all of us spend the majority of our waking youth hours in schools. Yeah. So how are the schools, maybe just generally, how are schools both supportive and oppositional or challenging for in this process, in this journey, for the percent of kids who find themselves questioning?
So I think that because students do spend so much time in this space, it's really important that it's an affirming space where kids can feel safe, feel free from distractions, and being able to focus on their learning. What happens with a lot of trans youth, if they're in a school that's not supportive, if they're in a particular classroom that's not supportive, they're going to spend more time in that class worrying about their safety, focusing on the things that are being said that are hurtful or that are not affirming, and they're losing out on an equal access to education because of that distraction. And then worried about, what we also see is then youth who are worried about what's happening in the hallways. So then they spend the first beginning and end part of that class dealing with the anxiety around their transition from classroom and bullying and what's happening in the hallways that's going unchecked within those settings.
So visualize if there is such an ideal, let's start primary grades, primary up, say, through 8th grade, those years. Visualize a school, if there is one, that's doing a really good job. And if you can't think of one that's doing a really good job, what that would look like if they were. What does it mean to be supportive? What would a school look like when you walk in? What would be the experiences of all kids? What would they, how would it work? How would it feel? What would it look like? I'm a parent, and I want to know, well, you know, I have kids, I want them to be in a healthy environment. What's that going to look like?
I really think part of it's just really letting kids sort of be free to explore who they are, right? So if a child is wearing, say, a dress, and you don't necessarily assume that child wears a dress, why is it hurting other kids? No, right? That's just what the child is wearing. Letting kids express themselves in their clothing how they want to, you know, depending on dress codes. I know some schools have those, or uniforms rather. But really like letting kids understand who they are and how they're expressing themselves, making sure you're not assigning different colors to genders, right? Maybe there are some kids who are boys who really like pink, who really like things. And so that's more the elementary level. I think when you get to the higher levels, it's how are you interacting with students as, you know, human beings, right? Are we believing students when they tell us who they are? If a student comes into a counselor's office and says, I'm dealing with issues of gender, I think I might be trans, are they being supported or are they being talked away from that? If there's bullying happening, how do we not only talk and support the trans student, but talk to the other students so they understand why that's wrong, so they understand why they don't need to be doing that, right? It's sort of building that environment of making sure people are not only being accepting, but growing and learning and allowing them to be free to explore their education, to explore themselves. And the point of our education system, right, is to prepare people for adulthood. So we should be making sure we're preparing all students for that adulthood in the best way they feel is going to be beneficial to them. And I don't know if you have other institutional.
Well, it's looking at the school trans-affirming policies as around universal design. There are a lot of things that impact trans people that also impact other folks. When we look at these things through a trans lens around access to gender-neutral bathrooms, there are lots of different reasons why people may want to use a private single-room locking bathroom, and having access to those also helps trans students. Of looking at not making assumptions about gender, making sure that anyone who uses a name different than the name that's on their birth certificate is able to do that in school. Again, reducing stress and distractions. We don't need to put a policy in place to call Michael Mike, but when we need to call someone by a name that we don't associate with how we feel comfortable about their gender, then all of a sudden people don't want to do these things unless there are policies and things are written out. But it's bringing this down to universal design, and so that lens of like, what does this look like in a different school? It's not a big deal. There's not like a special gendered thing. It's that gender neutral approaches to education are just happening across the board. We don't split groups, kids into, okay, boys line up here and girls line up there, using other creative ways of getting students to form two lines. It's looking at all those different things and challenging the biases around gender throughout the curriculum, and making changes to the curriculum only help all kids in how they look at gender, and challenging sexism and challenging misogyny. So that's not just about trans kids. I think that stuff helps all kids.
Yeah, and an example too, so in my niece's school, there was a student, and I believe that was while she was in maybe second grade. So there was a student who transitioned during the summer, I believe, and when she came back to school, she was reintroduced, not my niece, a classmate, but she was reintroduced with a new name, she was reintroduced with new pronouns, and that was how the teacher reintroduced her to the class, right? And so, and having teachers who were supportive of that, who were saying, this is the name we're going to use now, we're going to make sure, like as a class, as a group, that we're going to be respecting and supporting her, right? So also having, both from peers and from staff and from faculty, making sure that they're helping students with their process and their journey of coming into their identity.
So I can go several directions with this. Let's just talk about teachers, because that's where policies get implemented. As you were talking about a deadline for schools of about, what do we say, about a year from now, right, to comply.
They have until July 1st this year.
Oh,
to put
okay,
policies
next
in
month.
place. Yeah.
Next month. So have you been able to identify resistance yet, sources of resistance, foot dragging, ignoring the Department of Education?
I mean, I can't speak to specifics around that. I can say that most of the schools that I've interacted with and provided support to through young people have been very supportive, well-meaning, maybe needing some education, needing some guidance around the privacy issues or how to navigate conversations, but overwhelmingly of schools that want to support the young kids in those schools and to make sure that people are able to learn and that it's not an issue. And so I think that there's always some folks who are not there yet, and that's why this policy is now something that all the school departments are required to put in place.
Okay. We have to go to the bathroom issue, because that has been front and center in the media. Mm-hmm. So talk about that, the bathroom issue, and why it seems to be a lightning rod.
I think it's a lightning rod because I think it's an easy place to target, right? The idea of sort of saying someone's in the wrong bathroom. I think bathrooms is one of the places we have most accepted our society to be gendered, right? We know male and female bathrooms, men's and women's rooms, right? That's something we grow up with, it's something we're used to, it's something that everyone understands as a gendered space in our country. I believe with bathrooms, though, the targeting of trans people around bathrooms and bathroom bills and all of this hype we've seen is less about the use of a bathroom, right? Because trans people have been using bathrooms since the beginning of time, or since bathrooms existed, before bathrooms existed, right? We have been peeing, we have been releasing
So I've
ourselves,
read.
right? And so it's not that trans people just started existing and just started using bathrooms, right? It's more about, if you can't use a bathroom, you can't be in public, right? If you can't use a bathroom, it's harder to exist in a space, or to go throughout the world, or go throughout normal life. And so I think with the targeting of bathrooms and locker rooms and things like that, it's an easy place to sort of look at gender and say someone's in the wrong space, because we've always sort of thought about that as a very gendered space. We don't necessarily think about professions as strictly gendered the same way. We don't necessarily think about workplaces as strictly gendered the way we think about bathrooms. But bathrooms are easy to identify. With trans folks, again, we've been using bathrooms for a long time, at least all of the trans people I know. And I think it's, for us, right, in terms of what these bills are trying to do, they're trying to stop us from being able to show ourselves to other people. They don't want trans people to be trans, and so this is a way to say, well, if you can't use a bathroom, then you must have to do something else. Frankly, right, if I walk into a woman's bathroom with makeup, with a dress, with earrings on, or if I walk into a men's bathroom, rather, that puts me at danger, right? I'm the one who becomes at risk because of the way our society is set up.
I mean, physically.
Physically, right? Physical risk of being assaulted, either physically or sexually. And we know that happens. We know that trans women face exponentially high rates of both physical and sexual assault. With locker rooms and in schools, the bathroom bills around those, there's easy to make a boogeyman out of trans people. We're not seen as normal, we're seen as deviant. Gender is often confused with sexuality, so it gets pulled into the fray of sort of religion. And so it's easy to say, well, these kids are affecting these other kids, when really kids are just trying to be themselves. Kids are just trying to feel comfortable in who they are and what their bodies are. And I think with schools and with locker rooms, it's really, are we believing children, or are we still trying to say trans people don't know themselves or don't understand themselves enough for us to accommodate them?
Something else about the bathroom issue, just to bring up. I think it's important to remember that Rhode Island was the second state in the country to pass non-discrimination language that is inclusive of gender identity and expression. We did that in 2001. That was 17 years ago. The world has not ended since we've had protections around bathrooms. When we see other states looking at doing the exact opposite of trying to restrict the use of bathrooms, this focus is around the world is going to end and all of the paranoia that we're talking about. Rhode Island is a great example of a state where we've had these protections in place. People have been probably peeing next to trans people, again, since the beginning of time, and those aren't the issues. The issues around associating trans people with predators, as like this is part of the fear and this is the reason, is equating trans people with being other, with being objectified. And we know that that's not the case and that that's not what's happening.
So it's a boogeyman.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that language was really, it came from when we look at the anti-marriage movement, right? So the anti-marriage and anti-marriage equality movement pushed forward into, as they lost, trans people became the new boogeyman versus gay people getting married.
From the same sources of resistance.
The same sources of resistance are now
Heavily
pushing on the
religious
trans.
organizations, or identifiable kind of sources of resistance, or just kind of random?
I think, I wouldn't say it's religious organizations. I think it's organizations that are using religion as a tool, right? They're using religion to create sort of this moral disorder, or that's their go-to, that's the easiest thing, the easiest tool they have to say, oh, this is unnatural, right? And it's not, and it's also not always religious people. There are a lot of folks within sort of the alt-right movement, within the white supremacist movement, within some conservative movements, who are looking at trans people as sort of a threat to societal values, to the status quo, to societal norms. And trans people, trans folks coming out as transgender, becoming themselves, sort of playing with their expression and not conforming to what they're considered to be conforming to, or what they're supposed to be conforming to, that's sort of dangerous for how we think about society, right? And so there's this whole slippery slope argument, right? Well, if we let trans people use these bathrooms, then what's going to happen? But really, this is just about like letting people be who they are. It really, religion, I do think, gets used as a tool, but I don't think that's necessarily the honest source of a lot of the opposition to trans people.
So we have a few minutes left, and there's still several places to explore. We may have to schedule you back and talk some more about as maybe after the deadline for the schools and see where they've gone. But you mentioned the national scenes. In the news recently, we've seen resistance at the highest levels of the national government. The president has spoken decisively about his concern about trans people in the military and the rights of trans people. So talk about that, and does it have any impact in School X in Coventry or the state of Rhode Island?
So the impact that I see is that whenever these things come into this front public debate, as a social worker, I see the distress that it creates within our community. So regardless of the policy and the opposition and us like coming out on the right side of this eventually someday, I'm dealing with the day-to-day distress that folks are experiencing, the not feeling safe in their communities, the emboldened of people to speak out and harass and bully folks in our community that is unprecedented. Like, I'm seeing increased rates of this just in my personal work that we're hearing about. So that general sense of not feeling safe is absolutely being fueled through like all levels of government.
Okay. Are there any institutional, that was on a personal level, on an institutional level, can you think of any repercussions from the leadership at the national level?
Yeah, so so the president's administration is not just stripping trans people the right to be in the military, he's also stripped federal worker protections for trans people. He stripped guidance for schools to respect trans people on a national level, which was why it was so important that Rhode Island and RIDE pushed forward this policy, right? And so you're seeing this administration actually strip trans people of their rights and recognition in every level of society that they have power over on a federal level. And again, this goes back to the bathrooms, right? This is a much broader understanding or a much broader impact of what the bathroom bills are trying to do. It's trying to erase trans people from public life by saying if you're working and you get discriminated against, you no longer have protections if someone fires you because you're trans. It makes it much harder for a trans person to be employed and keep employment. If they're saying, you know, if you're a student in a college and you don't have protections as a trans student and your school discriminates against you, now it makes it much harder for you to go to school to attain a degree, to attain levels of achievement later on in your life. And so we're seeing what we're seeing is sort of a suppression of trans people on every level of society, not just necessarily the military and bathrooms.
So going back to the personal level,
Yeah.
if I am wondering about my identity and who I really am, and I'm more or less, well, it would matter, I guess, how much safety I experience in my school, but who could I call? Who could I go to and know I'll be able to process this safely?
As a student, I would encourage folks to look for the school social worker, potentially the guidance department. They can talk with the school nurse. A lot of those folks have gotten some levels of training in a lot of the school systems as a place to start in school. Outside of school, I often encourage kids to connect with Youth Pride, Inc. in Rhode Island with their drop-in center and the services that they offer that kids can go to and do not need parent permission there because it's just an open door walk-in space.
So people can get a hold of Youth Pride, people who are watching this program can get a hold of Youth Pride just by contacting ACLU, and our contact information will be on the screen. And we've had Youth Pride people here on this program. So that's one thing, one
That's
place
one
to
thing.
go, plus your own school, if it's safe enough, right? And if they're competent enough.
If there are families involved, the setting that I work in is medical based. People need consent from their families to get there, so that becomes a barrier for some of the folks that I see of being able to get to be able to get the Thunder Missing Access services. Families have to be involved.
Up till 18, or?
Yeah, to be able to consent to treatment, so they can't actually come in and be seen without that because we're a clinical setting.
So that may be a problem.
So that's a barrier.
Yeah. Another group at Providence Youth Student Movement, there I also facilitate Queer Transformative Roots, which is our queer justice program, and so that's also open to youth who might be questioning gender or sexuality in terms of LGBTQ issues, and they're welcome to come to Providence Youth Student Movement PrYSM as well.
Providence Youth Student Movement,
Yes.
PrYSM.
Yes.
I got it.
Yeah.
PrYSM. And they can find their way, viewers can find their way there same way. Come to the ACLU website and contact ACLU, or look up PrYSM. I suppose you can look up PrYSM.
Yes, and I can provide that information to you as well.
Okay.
And so there's also TGI Network of Rhode Island is a transgender advocacy group, and they are adult focused, but they have now a group that's happening on the 5th Tuesday of the month that's focused on families. It's not for youth, but it's for families who are struggling with their kids who are coming out. PFLAG is also a resource for families. But I really encourage young people who are struggling to look at support groups. I think peer support is just an invaluable experience. So just as talking about that, like meeting other people and hearing their stories really helps. As a clinician, I see that pushes people forward much more quickly to being able to make those connections with other folks.
So I suppose this is a rhetorical question with a quick yes, no. Our time is almost gone. But suppose I'm not a questioning young person. I sort of comfortable or feel like I know who I am, but I want to be supportive of others. Mm-hmm. Same places, call the same places and say, hey, I care.
Yeah, calling the same places. I would also recommend that allies can speak up when they see that these injustices are occurring, and to take some of that emotional weight away from trans people having to be the ones to speak up and say there's a problem. And so then those allies will not only put themselves in a position of trying to make a change before there's an issue, but in helping to shed light on them, that they would be a safe person for another student to come to if they were struggling.
Maybe help create safe environments in schools. So they're telling me that we're just about done, but I have to do this. I'm going to embarrass Justice.
Uh-oh.
Justice told me that she is a, quote, spoken word artist.
Yes. Yes.
What is that? And if I care enough, how do I find you to get whatever spoken word art is?
Yeah, so that means I perform and write poetry. There are some poems of mine online you can find under the name Justice Gaines or Justice Ameer, A-M-E-E-R. Right now, Google, a website should be up soon, but yeah, you just Google it.
Soon is June.
Soon is hopefully June.
Hopefully. I'm looking forward to seeing some spoken word art.
Yes.
I like that. So they're getting the hooks sharpened to just whoop us out of here. I want to thank Jaye Watts, old friends, Justice Gaines, a new friend. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you for having us.
If these issues are of concern or interest to you, the contact information for the ACLU is on the screen. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.